Good Vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to be starting the new week in a fantastic manner, learning some Torah on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house for the new week? Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in mid-Missouri, Shandora in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Duncan in Mobile, Alabama, Bell in Texas, Joe in the Inland Empire, Guy in Ohio, Marjorie in Virginia, Ella says Shalom, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Got a really interesting daf that's going to require our full attention. Our page is page 16 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Tonight we're going to open and, God willing, complete, right? Complete? Mishna number 4. Yeah, Mishna number 4 here in chapter 1. And these are the laws of damages. In this chapter, we've been exploring these primary categories of damagers and the kinds of damages that ensue. In the first Mishnah, we learned the ox, the pit, the fire, and the mave, which is probably defined as when people cause damage themselves. Then when we're talking about the ox, we're talking about goring or eating or trampling. And we've learned that for goring, right, there's the innocuous ox, the tam, versus the muad, the forewarned ox. Meaning if the ox gores other oxen or people on more than one occasion, looks like it's 2, and then it's considered forewarned, or 3. But at any rate, once it has shown that it is a dangerous ox that attacks people or other animals, then the owner has a different level of liability because it's foreseeable that he owns a dangerous animal. On the other hand, with regard to eating and trampling, that an ox will go and eat a pile of produce that's the kind of food that it normally eats, or that it will just walk over stuff and trample it. Well, it's the nature of oxen to eat what's in front of it or to walk where they want to walk without noticing what they're walking on top of. So with regards to eating and trampling, all oxen are considered muad. All oxen are considered forewarned, meaning the owner is forewarned. The owner knows, should know. It's obvious that the ox will eat what's in front of it or trample without thinking because it's an ox. What's under it. And so the owner will have to pay the full amount of the damages, and if he doesn't have money or movable goods on hand, it'll be taken from his superior quality land. Whereas the tam, the innocuous ox, if it gores, the owner is only liable for half the damages, and it can only come out of the value of the ox itself. Okay. So now that we've been talking about the tam and the muad, the innocuous ox and the forewarned ox, we can extend this principle to other kinds of animals, right? So if you own certain kinds of animals, you know, should you be considered as somebody who knows that that animal can cause damage? Or are some animals in the category, there's no reason to suspect that they're going to cause that kind of damage? That's why the title tonight shows lions do not make good pets. So you can imagine what category the lion falls in, but you might have a little surprise even there. Mishnah number 4. There are 5 damage-causing acts that an animal can perform twice and remain innocuous even when its owner was warned each time to prevent it from doing so. After the 3rd time, the animal is rendered forewarned. In such cases, the owner is liable, when it's innocuous, to pay only half of the damages. And there are 5 damage-causing acts for which an animal is considered forewarned. At times, even if it is forewarned at times, even if it had never caused damage in that manner. In such cases, the owner is liable to pay the full cost of the damage. Now, an animal is not, I just hate the way this terminology is, right? That forewarned, right? The muad, meaning that its owner knows, right? The owner is held to a standard of liability that he should know. Not that the animal was forewarned, but the animal is a forewarned animal. So an animal is not considered forewarned with regard to goring, i.e. not for goring with its horns, nor for pushing with its body, nor for biting, nor for crouching upon items in order to damage them, nor for kicking. In these cases, the animal is considered to be innocuous and its owner is liable for only half of the damages until it's done it twice, right? Then the third time we say, hey, you knew your animal was an animal that gores with its horns or that kicks with its feet or, that pushes things over or crouches on them in order to break things, right? Your animal's a dangerous animal. Now, concerning acts of damage performed with the tooth, not biting, but eating, right? The tooth means that the animal eats. You know it's going to eat, and if it's somebody's produce, the animal's not going to care whose produce it is. If it's in front of it, it will eat. Right, so that you know that the animal will do that, and that's why it's considered forewarned with respect to these categories, with regard to the tooth, and with the tooth. The animal is considered forewarned with regard to eating that which is fitting for it to eat. Meaning, you know that if the type of food your animal normally eats, it's going to eat that. But you're not considered forewarned, if there was a bunch of candy canes lying around and it turns out that your animal likes candy canes. I mean, that was not so foreseeable. Concerning acts of damage performed with the foot, the animal is considered forewarned with regard to breaking items while walking. And there is a forewarned ox, right, which already gored 3 times, and each time his owner was warned to safeguard his ox from doing so. And there is an ox that causes damage to the property of the injured party while on the property of the injured party, right? So if my ox goes on your property and gores, so even though it has never gored before, but if I let it go onto your property and it causes that kind of damage, then it's considered a forewarned ox. And there is the person, i.e. any damage done by a person, right? You are responsible for yourself, and so it's like you are forewarned, not to damage. We don't really care that you couldn't help yourself but damage another person. You damage another person, you're going to pay the full damages. Now, the Mishnah presents the law for wild animals. Wild animals. The wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the bardellas. What is a bardellas? The Gemara will explore what this word means. And the snake. These are considered forewarned even if they had never previously caused damage. You could have a pet lion. It's a very nice lion. It grew up in your house. It never hurt anybody. And then one day you're walking your lion down the street and it attacks somebody and really harms them badly. And you're going to say, oh, I had no idea. I had no idea that my lion could be dangerous. And the court's going to say, are you out of your mind? It's a lion. All lions are dangerous. Don't be ridiculous. It doesn't matter that you had a domesticated lion. Lions are dangerous, and you could consider yourself forewarned that if you have a pet lion and it harms someone, you're going to be liable for all damages like a forewarned ox and not like an innocuous ox. Rabbi Lazar says, when these animals are domesticated, they are not considered forewarned, but the snake is always considered forewarned. So Rabbi Lazar actually gives credence to the idea that there could be a domesticated wild animal, and then the owner would be considered not in the forewarned category if his animal has never harmed before the first time that it does do harm. But not a snake. There's no such thing, according to the sages, even Rabbi Lazar, as a domesticated snake. A snake is always considered dangerous. That's the Mishnah. Here's the Gemara. From the fact that the Mishnah teaches in the latter clause. Now, we're going to go through the interpretations of the Mishnah, and what we're looking for here is how the sages analyze this Mishnah, right? So that these are the acts of animals that we consider to be right, for which the animal is considered forewarned, and acts that for which it is not considered forewarned, right? So it's certain kinds of damage, it's so foreseeable that it's like the owner was already on notice, even though the animal hasn't done it before, and other acts not. To get into the nuance of this, they're going to sort of repeat the Mishnah a bunch of times to show, wait a minute, what does it really mean? What is the difference between the first clause and then the next two clauses? So we have to really pay attention carefully. So from the fact that the Mishnah teaches in its latter clause, concerning acts of damage performed with the tooth, the animal is considered forewarned with regard to eating that which it's fit for it to eat. So we learn by inference that we are dealing throughout the Mishnah with cases of damage done in the courtyard of the injured party, as one is exempt from liability for acts of damage classified as eating if they occur in the public domain, which is interesting, right? So if you leave sacks of grain lying around where an ox can come along and eat it, so then the ox, if it eats it, the owner of the ox is not liable for eating that grain. You should have been a little more careful with how you left your grain lying around. But if my ox walks onto your property, and eats your grain, then I certainly am liable. We've already established that. So now that our Mishnah is saying that, well, one of the categories of forewarned behavior is that the ox will eat what is in front of it, and since we already established that, but you're not liable for that behavior in the public domain, so it must be that we're only talking about these things are happening when my animal walks onto your property, a courtyard belonging to you. But that's going to create difficulties in other parts of our Mishnah, if that's actually what's going on in the public domain. And yet, the first clause of our Mishnah teaches an animal is not considered forewarned with regard to goring. Now, stating that it is not forewarned indicates that the liability of its owner is limited only with regard to paying the full cost of the damage, but the owner pays half the cost of the damage. Now, is that only going to be true when it happens on your property? No, that's in the public domain. So we seem to have a contradiction within the Mishnah between the first clause, which seems to be addressing what happens in the public domain, and the latter clause, which seems to be addressing only what happens on private property and not the property of the owner of the damaging animal. Now, the Gemara asks, who is it that holds that when damage classified as goring is done within the property of the injured party, the owner of the belligerent animal is liable for only half of the damages? Well, that is the rabbis, the majority, who say that the law of cases of goring performed by an innocuous animal, a tom, which is atypical behavior, right? It's an innocent animal, hasn't done this in the past. When this is done in the courtyard of the injured party, the law is that the owner of the ox pays half the cost of the damage, just as if it happened in the public domain. And that's the law. But then say and try to explain accordingly the next part of the latter clause of the Mishnah, which says, and there is a forewarned ox that gored 3 times, and each time his owner was warned to safeguard his ox from doing so. And there is an ox that causes damage to the property of the injured party while on the property of the injured party. And there is the person. Now, in these cases, the responsible party pays full damages. So with this clause, we arrive at the opinion not of the rabbis, but of Rabbi Tarfon, who says the law of cases of goring performed by an innocuous animal, which is atypical, but done in the courtyard of the injured party, the owner of the ox pays the full cost of the damages, right? Rabbi Tarfon says even if it's an innocuous animal, if it goes onto your property and harms your animal, I'm liable for the full cost of the damages. So which is this? So according to who is our Mishnah? Is it according to the rabbis who say on private property, full damages unless it's goring by an innocuous animal, in which case it's only half the damages? Or is it according to Rabbi Tarfon who says that when my animal enters your property and harms your property, your produce or your animal, I pay full damages? Who is our Mishnah according to? So the Gemara then asks, could it be that the first part of the second clause of the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, and the next part of that same second clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon? And the Gemara answers, yes. As Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, sharp-toothed one, Shinana, leave the Mishnah and follow after me and my interpretation, that the first part of the second clause of the Mishnah is in accordance with the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Tarfon, and the next part of the second clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon who disagrees with the majority. So the Gemara presents a different interpretation of the Mishnah. So it seems awkward that within the Mishnah and within a clause of the Mishnah, part of that clause is according to the rabbis and part of it is according to Rabbi Tarfon, who disagrees with the rabbis. That seems to be an awkward construction of a Mishnah, and especially of a single clause within a Mishnah. So the Gemara is going to try to present a different interpretation that would remove this difficulty. So Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rav, and now we're actually on 16a, the entire Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who says if it's on my ox on your property, I pay full damages no matter what. So according to this view, the first part of the second clause is stated with regard to a jointly owned courtyard, which under the terms of their partnership is designated for the use of one of them, meaning in this case the injured party, to keep his produce there, right? So you and I jointly own a courtyard, and we have agreed in advance that you can keep your produce there. Okay, and for this one, and for that one to keep their oxen there, right? So we jointly own a courtyard, and we've agreed you can keep your produce there, and both of us can keep our oxen in this jointly owned courtyard. Accordingly, with regard to the damage of the category of eating caused by one's partner's ox to the injured party's produce in that courtyard, it is equivalent to the case of a courtyard owned exclusively by the injured party. Only you can keep your produce there. I don't keep my produce there. So it's like my ox is in your domain for the purposes of your produce. And the ox's owners, that's why I'm liable for all the damage. But with regard to the damage of the category of goring, since we are both allowed to keep our oxen there, then this courtyard now is equivalent to the public domain. And if his innocuous ox causes damage there, one is liable for only half the cost of the damage. You see how Rabbi Elazar had to create like a pretty, specific set of circumstances in order for us to be able to say that the second clause of the Mishnah is according to one view and not split views. But at least he came up with an idea. So Rav Kahana said, I stated this teaching of Rabbi Elazar before Rav Zevid of Nehardea. And he said to me, are you really able to interpret that the entire Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon? But doesn't the Mishnah teach, concerning acts of damage performed with the tooth, the animal is considered forewarned with regard to eating that which is fitting for it to eat? And this indicates that only if what it eats is fitting for it, then yes, one is liable for the full cost of the damage. But if it eats something that is not fitting for it, the owner would not be liable for the full cost of the damage, but only half, right? Because if the animal goes and eats something that it never ate before, that wasn't foreseeable. So with respect to that food that it never ate before, it's like an innocuous ox. So Rav Kahana explains his difficulty. And if the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, the owner should be liable to pay the full cost of the damage, even if his animal ate something not fitting for it. As doesn't Rabbi Tarfon say, the law of the cases of goring performed by an innocuous animal, which is atypical, but if it's done in the courtyard of the injured party, is that you pay the full cost. So even under Rabbi Elazar's circumstances, if my ox eats your produce in our jointly owned courtyard, but where only you have the right to keep produce there, so it still is going to make a difference according to our Mishnah if that produce is something that my ox typically eats or not. You'd have to further refine Rabbi Elazar's circumstances to say, and the produce that was sitting there is and the produce that was sitting there is atypical, right? Is atypical. for me to consider my animal innocuous, right? But since it's our jointly owned property, that's why it had to be special circumstances for it to not be according to the opinion of the rabbis who say, yeah, even if it's on your property, if it's an innocuous situation, it's only half damages, not full damages. So rather, Rav Kahana said, actually, it must be that the entire Mishnah is not in accordance with the Rabbi Tarfon, but rather is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. Okay, so the rabbis say if it's an innocuous thing, an innocuous act, like goring by an innocuous animal, then even if it happens on the property of the injured party, the owner of the ox is going to pay half damages. So how are we going to square that with the latter part? Let's see. So actually it must be that the entire Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, and the Mishnah is incomplete, and this is what it is teaching. The opening clause should be understood as saying there are 5 damage-causing acts that animals can perform twice and remain innocuous, but if they were warned for performing those acts 3 times, with regard to the 5 acts, they are considered forewarned, i.e. the Mishnah is not referring to 2 different sets of damages, 5 acts for which the animal is considered innocuous and 5 for which it is considered forewarned. But rather, both statements in the initial clause of the Mishnah are referring to the same 5 acts of goring, and they teach that although the animal is initially considered innocuous with regard to these 5 acts, after it has done it twice and the owner's been warned, then it becomes forewarned even with respect to those acts, like goring. So the next part of the Mishnah then provides a new halacha, a new law. But for the damage of the categories of eating and trampling, an animal is considered forewarned from the outset. Okay, so this seems like a very logical reading. So the next 2 items in the Mishnah that are forewarned ox and an ox that causes damage on the property of an injured party should be understood as a question and answer. And where does the forewarned status with regard to these acts apply? It applies in the courtyard of the injured party, meaning that if it happens in your courtyard, then it's like it's forewarned, right? We treat it as if it's forewarned. So according to Rav Kahana's explanation, the statement in the courtyard of the injured party refers only to cases of eating or trampling, but not to cases of goring. And therefore, it is true even according to the opinion of the rabbis. But Ravina says to Rav Kahana, no. Doesn't the Mishnah below, the Mishnah that we're going to encounter on page 24b, teach with regard to the case of an ox that causes damage to the property of the injured party while on the property of the injured party, right? So my ox entered your property. So with regard to the case of an ox that causes damage to the property of the injured party on the property of the injured party, which was stated in the Mishnah that we're now talking about, our Mishnah tonight, how so? I.e., what are the circumstances in which one is liable to pay the full cost of the damage? And the Mishnah on page 24b proceeds to list acts of damage that are classified as goring. So Ravina now states his objection. Granted, if you say that our Mishnah here discusses that case, i.e. that it is referring to goring, it is due to that ruling that the Mishnah teaches on 24b. How so? And proceeds to discuss one's liability for goring, as it is elucidating the case mentioned in our Mishnah here. But if you say, as Rav Zevid suggests, that the Mishnah here that we're discussing tonight does not discuss goring alone, what is the meaning of the Mishnah on 24b when it asks, how so, and then proceeds to discuss one's liability for goring? Right? It seems like the Mishnah on page 24b is telling us that our Mishnah here, at least the first half of it, is just talking about goring and actions that are like goring, as distinguished from eating and trampling. So, says Ravina, the Mishnah is incomplete, and this is what it is teaching. There are 5 damage-causing acts that animals can perform twice and remain innocuous. But if they were warned for performing those acts 3 times with regard to these 5 acts, they are considered forewarned. Then the next part of the Mishnah provides another law. But for the damage of the categories of eating and trampling, an animal is considered forewarned from the outset, and this is a case in which all agree that the animal is classified like a forewarned ox. And there is the case of an ox that causes damage to the property of the injured party while on the property of the injured party, which is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Tarfon and the rabbis. And there are other cases similar to these in which animals are considered forewarned from the outset, namely the wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the bardalos, and the snake. And the Gemara notes this interpretation of the Mishnah is also taught in a Baraisa. There are 5 damage-causing acts that animals can perform twice and remain innocuous. But if they were warned for performing those acts 3 times with regard to those 5 acts, then they are considered forewarned. And then the next part of the Mishnah provides a different law, but for damage of the categories of eating and trampling, an animal is considered forewarned from the outset. And this is the case in which all agree that the animal is classified like a forewarned ox. And there is the case of the ox that causes damage to the property of the injured party while on the property of the injured party, and that is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Tarfon and the rabbis. And there are other cases similar to these in which animals are considered forewarned from the outset, namely wolf, lion, bear, leopard, bardalos, and the snake. In other words, the interpretation we just heard in the Gemara is backed up by the exact same interpretation which was classified as a baraisa from another source. Now, there are those who raise this issue as a contradiction, and through doing so arrived at the same conclusions, like this. We learned in the opening clause of the Mishnah there are 5 damage-causing acts that animals can perform twice and remain innocuous, and there are 5 damage-causing acts for which an animal is considered forewarned. With regard to this, one can ask, but is there nothing else? But aren't there the cases mentioned in the continuation of the Mishnah? The wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the bardalos, and the snake. These are considered to be forewarned even if they had never caused damage before, because they're so inherently dangerous. And they resolve the contradiction through that which Ravina said. The Mishnah is incomplete, and this is what it is teaching. There are 5 damage-causing acts that animals can perform twice and remain innocuous, but if they were warned for performing those acts 3 times with regard to the 5 acts, they are considered forewarned. Thereafter, they are like a forewarned ox. And then the next part of the Mishnah provides another law, but for damage of the categories of eating and trampling, an animal is considered forewarned from the outset. And this is a case in which all agree that an animal is classified as a forewarned ox. Then there is the case of the ox that causes damage to the property of the injured party, on the property of the injured party, and that is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Tarfon and the majority. And there are other cases similar to these in which animals are considered forewarned from the outset, namely the wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the bardalos, and the snake. Okay, I think we have a good understanding now of how the Mishnah works. So the Mishnah teaches an animal is not considered forewarned with regard to goring, i.e. not for goring with its horns, nor for pushing with its body, nor for biting, nor for crouching upon items to damage them, right? What are the characteristics of these actions that are classified as similar to goring? The animal does it in order to cause damage, right? Poking with its horns or kicking with its feet or pushing with its body, not incidentally like it was walking by, but where it's trying to break something. It's not getting pleasure out of it like eating. It's not mindless, just walking where it was led and happens to walk over something. The animal's trying to cause damage. That's why these other actions are like goring. So like goring, if the animal has never done it before and then it causes harm through one of these actions, the owner only pays half damages because it's a tom. It's an innocuous ox with respect to these actions. Rabbi Elazar says they taught this only with regard to large vessels, as it is atypical for an animal to crouch upon them, and therefore the act is classified as a subcategory of goring. So for example, it's unusual for an animal to ram your car. Animals don't usually do that, right? But, says Rabbi Elazar, with respect to small vessels, it's pretty, obvious that if you have a bull in a china shop, it's going to do damage, right? and even just turning its head, right, which is not the same as walking by. It like damaged it seemingly on purpose, but it's so fragile, it's so easy for it to break things that we're going to say that with respect to small vessels, these actions, kicking, couching, even goring, the animal is considered a forewarned ox, a muad, from the outset. Very big distinction right here, right? Says Rabbi Elazar. But if the animal crouched, only with regard to crouching. But if the animal crouched upon small vessels, since that is its typical manner of behavior, it is classified as a subcategory not of goring, but rather of trampling. So breaking small vessels by crouching on them is not akin to goring, where we have innocuous behavior of the first two times, but rather it is akin to trampling, where the ox is considered forewarned, a muad from the outset. Now the Gemara suggests, let us say that the following Baraisa supports the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. An animal is considered forewarned from the outset to walk in its typical manner and to break or crush a person or an animal or vessels. So the Baraisa indicates that an animal's typical manner is to crush vessels, presumably by crouching down upon them. And this would seem to contradict the Mishnah that states that such behavior is atypical. It would appear the only resolution to this contradiction is if one accepts the distinction made by Rabbi Elazar, that the Mishnah concerns large vessels and the Baraisa concerns small vessels. But the Gemara rejects this. No. Perhaps the Baraisa concerns a case where the animal pushed against the utensils from the side and crushed them against a wall, but it does not concern a case where it crouched upon them. And there are those who say a different version of this discussion as follows. Rabbi Elazar says, do not say that the Mishnah's ruling refers only to large vessels, as it is atypical for an animal to crouch upon them. But if the animal crouched upon small vessels, well, that is its typical manner. And for that type of damage, the animal is considered muad, a forewarned animal from the outset. So rather, the Mishnah refers even to small vessels, as it is atypical for an animal to crouch upon them. So the Gemara objects from a Baraisa. An animal is considered forewarned from the outset to walk in its typical manner and to crush a person or an animal or vessels. And Rabbi Elazar says perhaps the Baraisa concerns only a case where the animal pushed against the utensils from the side and crushed them against a wall. What does it mean when it says to crush utensils or even people? Are we saying that it walks over them? Well, that's clearly trampling. That's its own category. Does crush mean that if a cow, big fat cow, is walking down a really narrow alley, that it's just not going to be concerned that as you, a human being, press yourself up against the wall to get out of the way, that it's going to squeeze past you, even though it's kind of like crushing your ribs, right? That the animal is not trying to harm you, it's just walking by. So you can make a good argument that that's like trampling and not like goring. So Rabbi Elazar said, perhaps the Baraisa concerns only a case where the animal pushed against the utensils from the side and crushed them against a wall. Now, there are those who raise this issue as a contradiction. We learned in the Mishnah, an animal is not considered forewarned with regard to goring, i.e. not for goring with its horns, nor for pushing with its body, nor for biting, nor for crouching upon items in order to damage them. But isn't it taught in a Baraisa? An animal is considered forewarned from the outset to walk in its typical manner and to break or crush a person or an animal or vessels. In order to resolve this contradiction, Rabbi Elazar said, La kasha, it is not difficult. Here in the Mishnah, the reference is to large vessels, while there in the Baraisa, the reference is to small vessels. Now let's talk about these wild animals. The wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the bardellas, and the snake. These are considered to be forewarned even if they had never caused damage before. If you keep a wild animal, a wild, predatory, carnivorous, what's the word I'm looking for? Large feline, right? I mean, if you're a tiger king and you keep tigers around your home and they harm someone, you can't say, oh, my tiger never harmed anyone before, because you are keeping a wild, vicious animal. And even if you domesticated it, it's considered dangerous. And if it hurts someone, you owe the full damages, like a muad, like a forewarned ox. It's as if it had already done the damage because it's so foreseeable. Now, The Gemara asks, okay, you said the wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the bardellus, and the snake. So, what is a bardellus? Rabbi Yehuda said it is a nafresa. And the Gemara asks, so what is a nafresa? Rabbi Yosef said it is an appa. What is an appa? The Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. In addition to the list of animals that are considered forewarned, Rabbi Meir says also the hyena. Rabbi Elazar says also the snake. And Rabbi Yosef said an explanation of the baraisa, the hyena mentioned by Rabbi Meir, this is the animal called an appa. So if Rabbi Yosef understands a hyena to be an appa, how could he also claim above that it is a bardellus? So the Gemara explains, it is not difficult, la kasha. Here in the baraisa, Rabbi Meir is referring to a male hyena, and there in the Mishnah, the reference is to a female hyena. And so they're going to disagree, and some say that the bardellus refers to a hyena or to a marten or to a polecat, and some say to a cheetah. Okay, so they're going to argue about what is the identity of the bardellus. Now that we've mentioned the male hyena and the female hyena, so the Gemara is going to say something that just seems ridiculous to the modern ear, and I caution you, don't ever think that just because this was written 2,000 years ago, that they're less sophisticated than we are and we're so much smarter than they are, and what they say doesn't make sense. Because it won't make sense to us initially until we think about it. Okay, so says the Gemara, as it is taught in the Baraisa, a male hyena, after 7 years, transforms into an insect-eating bat. And an insect-eating bat transforms after 7 years into an herb-eating bat. And an herb-eating bat, after 7 years, transforms into a thistle. And a thistle, after 7 years, metamorphoses or transforms into a briar. And a briar, after 7 years, transforms into a demon. And similarly, a person's spine, 7 years after his death, transforms into a snake. But the Gemara qualifies this last statement, and this applies only to a case where that person did not bow during the blessing of Thanksgiving, which we say during the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, the prayer, the main prayer with the 18 blessings that we say every day. So let's just pause. What did the Gemara just say? That a male hyena turns into a female hyena, it turns into one kind of bat, and then another kind of a bat, and then it turns into a plant? What? You know, even if the sages didn't have the benefit of modern science and DNA research, they had a tremendous, and we've seen it before, tremendous and extensive library, so to speak, of observations and trial and error. And nobody ever saw one of these animals transform into one of these other animals. So what is the Mishnah saying? What is the Gemara saying? So one interpretation of this, I won't go into all the notes, one interpretation of this is that these animals are considered particularly dangerous, right? Or even if when you're talking about hyenas and bats, and also when you're talking about thistles and briars, again, these are plants that are dangerous to people in various ways, and that after they die and sort of rot into the ground, that their substance is going to return in another form, which is even more dangerous. And that the lesson that's actually being taught here, I'll just read it as Rav Steinsaltz said it. It is possible that the claims should be taken as referring to metaphysical development and teaching that something that is evil, if it is not uprooted from the world, will continue to develop a deeper level of evil, and in each cycle of development, it will transform into something worse. And I'm reminded of the teaching that we have elsewhere that if you are kind to the cruel, you will end up being cruel to the kind, right? Coddling evil in the world because you're afraid of hurting its feelings or because you're simply afraid of it is not a viable pattern of behavior. right? That if you coddle evil or you run from evil, you allow evil to fester, its nature is to grow and to transform into other shapes and forms and movements and people and ideas and ideologies that simply grow worse and worse. You have to confront evil, and I think that's the lesson that's being taught there. We return to the Gemara. Now, the Gemara analyzes this Baraisa, which about these wild animals, that if you keep one and it harms someone else, it's like it was, a muad. It's like a forewarned ox. It doesn't have to cause damage in order to know that it could cause damage. So the master says above, in addition to the list of animals that are considered forewarned, Rabbi Meir says also the hyena. Now we're on 16b. And Rabbi Lazar says also the snake. Now, by using the term also, Rabbi Lazar suggests that he considers a snake to be forewarned to the same extent as the other animals in the Mishnah's list, which, according to his opinion, are not considered to be forewarned if they are domesticated. And the Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that Rabbi Lazar says when these animals are domesticated, they are not considered to be forewarned, but the snake is always forewarned. So the Gemara says, okay, well then you have to amend and teach the Baraisa as saying that Rabbi Lazar says a snake, instead of saying also a snake. So accordingly, the Baraisa is teaching that he holds that only a snake is considered to be forewarned under all circumstances, because he holds that even if it is domesticated, it is still prone to cause damage. One last thing I'll say about that list of, one kind of animal transforming into another, or really one kind of danger transforming into another kind of danger. Almost like playing whack-a-mole, right, with dangerous movements in various parts of the world. But if you look at it just specifically, like one kind of animal transforms into an animal, that makes no sense to us. And maybe this was just a metaphorical passage. Maybe this was a passage having to do with, what goes on underground among the fungi and the bacteria that, they didn't really have access to microscopes and couldn't see how, bodies dissolved and kind of return as different kinds of life. Maybe. Or maybe, says Rav Steinsaltz, it would appear the Gemara here is not referring to a transformation that is recognized by modern science, right? It's a very interesting way of putting it. A transformation that is not recognized by modern science, right? Could be that the sages were just wrong about something, or it also could be that there were goings-on in the ancient world which are no longer going on today. I think that's very possible. I think that is very possible. Some things just never change. But, when the world was younger, when the world was closer to the age of the flood, when the world was closer to creation, when there had been fewer people to look at things and accept that they are the way they are, perhaps the world was more fluid than it is now. That's a long conversation for another day, but it's for another day. Okay. Now, the Gemara considers cases of damage caused by a lion. Shmuel says, with regard to a lion that kills an animal in the public domain, if it clawed its prey and ate it, the lion's owner is exempt from liability. But if it first tore apart its prey with its teeth in order to kill it and only then ate it, the owner is liable for the damage. And we're like, what? Obviously, the animal's a dangerous animal, so if it harms somebody else's animal in the public domain, we just said it's a muad, it's considered a forewarned animal. So it's like an ox that, that gored, except that because it's a lion, we say it's like an ox that has already gored twice, and so people are liable for its act of goring. What's he saying here? He says, well, if the animal causes harm in a manner that is atypical for it, right? So what do lions do? Lions actually I've seen the videos, right? A lion catches the buffalo, jumps on top of it, bites its neck, right? And, sometimes breaks the spine, sometimes lets it bleed out, and only when the animal is dead, the lion starts eating. So it would seem like if the lion did something unusual for lions, if it just ran up, took a bite of an animal and went off, that would be such uncharacteristic behavior that even if it's a lion, it's considered not the kind of harm that we would call a lion forewarned about that kind of danger. It's not. In other words, there is a distinction. You can't just say any harm that a lion causes. It would have to be the kind of harm that lions cause, typically, for it to be considered forewarned, even without having done it before. But if the lion, starts talking and talks somebody into committing suicide, okay, that's so bizarre. Obviously, that's not what we were foreseeing. And so even though a lion did it, we would not consider it forewarned for that purpose. So the Gemara elucidates. If it clawed its prey and ate it, the owner is exempt because it is the typical manner to claw its prey and eat it, and it is therefore equivalent to the case of an animal that eats fruit and vegetables belonging to someone else. Therefore, it is classified as eating, done in the public domain. Oh, this is a different analysis. Now they're saying, this I don't understand. So now they're saying this is the typical manner of a lion. This is what it does. It claws and then eats. So since that's so typical for the purpose of eating, so now what we're talking about is eating. And if it eats, well, then we said eating and trampling in the public domain, it is exempt. It's only eating and trampling when it's on your property. So that we're not going to apply that to a lion? Really? Let's keep reading. Therefore, it is classified as eating done in the public domain, and the owner of the lion is exempt. But if the lion first tore apart its prey to kill it, since this is not its typical manner, then the act is classified like goring, for which an owner is liable even in a public thoroughfare. So it's actually quite the opposite of what I said a moment ago, but let's keep listening. The Gemara asks, is this to say that tearing apart its prey is not the typical manner of a lion? But isn't it written, the lion tears apart for its young and strangles for its lionesses, and it fills its caves with prey, and its den with that which was torn apart. Nahum 2:13. So the description in the verse clearly indicates that it is the typical manner of a lion to tear apart its prey. So the Gemara answers that each phrase of this verse was referring not to a situation where the lion catches prey for its own immediate use, but to one where it provides food for its young. As it says, the lion tears apart for its young, and to provide food for its lionesses. That's why it says, and it strangles for its lionesses. To provide food for its young cubs in the lair, and it filled its lair with prey. And to provide food for the young cubs in its den. So that's why it says, and its den with that, and its den with that which it has torn apart. Therefore, we cannot learn from this verse that it is the typical manner of a lion to tear apart prey for its own immediate use. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa concerning acts classified as eating? And similarly, in the case of a wild animal, including a lion that entered the courtyard of the injured party and tore apart the courtyard owner's animal and ate its meat, the owner of the wild animal pays the full cost of the damage? And the Gemara answers, well, with what are we dealing here? This is a case where it tore apart the animal in order to leave it for later consumption. Since this is typical behavior for a lion, the lion is considered forewarned with regard to it. So the Gemara asks, well, doesn't the Baraisa teach and ate its meat? And the Gemara answers, this is a case where the lion initially killed the animal to leave it for later consumption, but then reconsidered and ate it. So the Gemara questions this understanding. How can we know what the animal's initial intentions were? And furthermore, if one accepts this claim, then the ruling of Shmuel is also called into question, as perhaps the case he ruled on is a case like this, where the lion initially intended to leave the prey he killed for later consumption, and therefore the owner should be exempt. And the Gemara therefore rejects this understanding. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said the Baraisa teaches two cases disjunctively and should be understood as teaching two laws. With regard to a lion that tore apart an animal in order to leave it for later consumption, or a lion that clawed its prey and ate it, since each acted in the typical manner of the lion, the owner pays the full cost of the damage. Okay, that makes sense. That's what I was saying earlier, right? The lion foreseeably will act this way, so you pay. So Ravina said, it is the typical manner of a wild lion to kill its prey and then eat it. And therefore, such damage is not classified like goring, but rather like eating. Accordingly, if the damage was done in the public domain, the lion's owner is exempt from liability. And when Shmuel says that an owner is liable if his lion does so, that was with regard to a domesticated lion, and in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who says it is not the typical manner of a domesticated wild animal to attack. Accordingly, the act is classified as being in the category of goring, for which one is liable even in a public thoroughfare. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, then even when the lion clawed its prey and ate it, the owner should be liable for any damage it causes in a public domain, since according to Rabbi Elazar, such behavior is atypical for a domesticated lion. Why then does Shmuel rule that in such a case the owner is exempt? I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. So the Gemara concedes that its presentation of Ravina's opinion is untenable. Rather, Ravina's explanation was not stated in reference to Shmuel's ruling, but rather in reference to the Baraisa, cited above, that discusses a case where a lion causes damage in the courtyard of the injured party. Accordingly, Ravina's statement should be understood as follows. When the Baraisa teaches that one is liable if one's lion tore apart an animal and ate it, that was with regard to a domesticated lion and in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who says it is not the typical manner of a domesticated wild animal to attack. And the Gemara asks, if that is so, since the act is atypical behavior for a lion, it should be classified as goring, and the owner should be required to pay for only half the damage. And the Gemara answers, the Baraisa is referring to a case where the lion was forewarned. And the Gemara questions further, but if that is so, what is the reason that the Baraisa teaches this among the subcategories of eating? It should have taught it among the subcategories of goring. And the Gemara concedes this is a difficulty. Bottom line is, because you have, the distinction between goring and eating, right? Where goring, you have the innocuous and the forewarned. But we said that a wild animal like a lion goes right to the category of forewarned, even without having done it before, except according to Rabbi Elazar. But then you have the category of eating, right? Where eating is different in the sense that eating, it's like forewarned. There's no such thing as an innocuous eater. You're always on notice as the owner of an animal that it might eat something in its typical manner. But the ox eating produce in the public domain is exempt. So if you're going to say that a lion could be compared to an ox for various behaviors, then when it eats in its typical manner and it does so in the public domain, the owner of the lion should be exempt. But right away, we recoil at that because, what do you mean? If you have a lion in the public domain and it eats something in its typical manner, what's this guy doing with his lion in the public domain where it could eat? And that's definitely a problem. And in the note, it says, it's not like we're going to allow that to happen. Okay? We'll find a different legal vehicle to say you can't have blood on your hands. You can't walk around with a lion that might harm people. But in terms of damages, if fitting it into the category of goring or into the category of eating, there's more of a conversation. Okay. That's what I've got for us tonight in terms of questions on Bava, Kamma 16. I think it's just from Bill. The lion that the sages are talking about here and the lion we're probably thinking of are not the same species, but close cousins. While today there is only the African lion. We have mountain lions here in California, but okay, let's say when you just say lion, you mean the African lion. But there was another species, says Bill, the Eurasian lion, which ranged from Europe to the Iranian plateau. And it's the Eurasian lion one sees on European coats of arms, which is why they look a little odd compared to modern lions. That's interesting. I never knew that. Today, the Eurasian lion is extinct, but some speculate that the endangered Asiatic lion, found only in a small part of India, might be a subspecies. Bill, you're carrying a lot of information in that head of yours. And after 7.5 years of Talmud study, how much more? Great to be learning with all of you on a Saturday night. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for Mishna number 5 and page 17. And with that, God willing, we'll complete chapter 1 of Tractate Bava Kamma. good night, good vach, shavua.